Hello and welcome. I am Daisy, your hostess. Hope you're doing well, and thank you for joining me today. Now, the hidden power. And as any curious person, the title drew me in. Hidden power of what? And of course, without going any further, I supposed it was the hidden power within me. Yeah, that's the title of this book. This is by Thomas Troward. So what are these hidden powers? And if I were aware of them, would it benefit me to know? Of course, in the process of enlightenment, I would also ask, how once I become aware of my hidden power, how could I employ them to benefit and serve others? This book was authored by Thomas Troward, a former divisional judge in Punjab, also honorary member of the Medico-Legal Society of New York, and first vice president of the International New Thought Alliance. I also have another book by Thomas Troward. Feel free to navigate through my playlist. These next few chapters will find Troward exploring esoteric concepts as the draw of life energy. Is it from within or from without? And what are the differences from each source? He will also discuss the similarities between the New Thought and the Bible and show that possibly the difference could be just of words, that the essence of truth is a common theme to both of them. If you've been following along, I hope you've garnered a few keys that will help you open even further doors of consciousness. I try to group these chapters into video series that will make it easier to consume. In this particular video, I could have made it into two, but unfortunately, the length of the chapters were out of balance and it did not make any sense where the cutoff would be. So I thought best to clump it all together in one big video. And so here we have the fourth video of the series. So if you've just showed up at this video, I'm glad you found me. Please make sure to catch the other chapters in the playlist. There are many reasons why I find myself reading books. Sometimes it's for the entertainment value. Other times it's the curiosity. Usually it's the content or a specific confirmation that I'm looking for about something that I had known about. Other times it's coming back to a familiar author. Yet one thing seems to be a constant for me, that is, that I am provided with a gift. And it's usually that one thing that I'm looking for at that moment in my life. And sometimes I don't even know exactly what I'm looking for, but I know that there's something that I am seeking. Yet I know that I found that something because it rings loud and truth to me. For example, Troward didn't title any of the chapters The Guide to Manifestation, yet he mentioned natural laws. And he gave a child's description of it. And bingo, that was my golden nugget. And in just a few simple words, he described how natural laws work. And I believe that any one individual who puts themselves on the path as a student of the divine mystery of life will come to that one moment where he or she wants to know the laws of nature. And drawing from my own personal experience as a former police officer, I draw a parallel that ignorance of the law does not free or excuse any one of us from the penalties of violating the law. So I believe that once we are on this path, it behooves us to first learn the great laws of nature, which our Creator has encoded in every aspect of nature. And let's keep in mind, without bringing any religious affiliation, because there's so many beautiful religions that try to guide us to that concept of understanding these laws created by our Creator. And so in that aspect, once we have learned these, we will be in a position to apply and to demonstrate this mastery by the way we live our life. Troward did provide us with a litmus test so that we can every now and then confirm for ourselves if we are in tune or in alignment with the great law. And this was very simple. Just ask ourselves, does what I'm engaged in, what I'm doing, or what I'm thinking operate for the expansion or for the restriction of life? The answer you come up with will help you either continue onward or adjust. If this makes any sense to you, please leave me a comment. Other than that, let's turn the page. Chapter 16, Separation and Unity. The prince of this world cometh, and hath nothing in me. From the book of John, chapter 14, verse 30. In these words of the Grand Master of Divine Science gives us the key to the great knowledge. Comparison with other passages shows that the terms here rendered prince and world can equally be rendered principle and age. Jesus is here speaking of a principle of the present age, so entirely opposed to the principle of which he himself was the visible expression, as to have no part in him. It is the utter contradiction of everything that Jesus came to teach and to exemplify. The account Jesus gave of himself was that he came to bear witness to the truth, and in order that men might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. Consequently, the principle to which he refers must be the exact opposite of truth and life. That is, it must be the principle of falsehood and death. What, then, is this false and destructive principle which rules the present age? If we consider the gist of the entire discourse, of which these are the concluding words, we shall find that the central idea which Jesus has been most strenuously endeavoring to impress upon his disciples at their last meeting before the crucifixion is that of the absolute identity and out-and-out oneness of the Father and the Son, the principle of the perfect unity of God and man. If this, then, was the great truth which he was thus earnestly solicitous to impress upon his disciples' minds when his bodily presence was so shortly to be removed from them, the truth of unity, may we not reasonably infer the opposing falsehood to be the assertion of separateness, the assertion that God and man are not one? The idea of separateness is precisely the principle on which the world has proceeded from that day to this, the assumption that God and man are not one in being, and that the matter is of a different essence from spirit. In other words, the principle that finds favor with the intellectuality of the present age is that of duality, the idea of two powers and two substances opposite in kind, and therefore repugnant to each other, permeating all things, and so leaving no wholeness anywhere. The entire object of the Bible is to combat the idea of two opposing forces in the world. The good news is said to be that of reconciliation. The second book of Corinthians, verse 18, where also we are told that all things are from God, hence leaving no room for any other power or any other substance, and the great falsehood which it is the purpose of the good news to expose is everywhere in the Bible proclaimed to be the suggestion of duality, which is some other mode of life that is not the one life, but something separate from it, an idea which it is impossible to state distinctly without involving a contradiction in terms. Everywhere the Bible exposes the fiction of the duality of separation as the great lie, but nowhere in so emphatic and concentrated a manner as in that wonderful passage of Revelations, where it is figured in the mysterious number of the beast. He that hath understanding, let him count the number of the beast, and his number is 666. Revelation chapter 13, verse 18. Let me point out the great principle expressed in this mysterious number. It has other more particular applications, but this one general principle underlies them all. It is an established maxim that every unity contains in itself a trinity, just as the individual man consists of body, soul, and spirit. If we would perfectly understand anything, we must be able to comprehend it in its threefold nature. Therefore, in symbolic numeration, the multiplying of the unit by 3 implies the completeness of that for which the unit stands. And again, the threefold repetition of a number represents its extension to infinity. Now mark what results if we apply these representative methods of numerical expression to the principles of oneness and of separateness respectively. Oneness is unity, and 1 times 3 equals 3, which intensified to its highest expression is written as 3, 3, 3. Now apply the same method to the idea of separateness. Separateness consists of one and another one, each of which, according to the universal law, contains a trinity. In this view of duality, the totality of things is 2, and 2 times 3 equals 6. And intensifying this to its highest expression, we get 6, 666, which is the number of the beast. Why of the beast? Because separateness from God, or the duality of opposition, which is also a duality of polarity, which is dual unity, recognizes something as having essential being, which is not the one spirit. And such a conception can be verbally rendered only by some word that in common acceptance represents something, not only lower than the divine, but lower than the human also. It is because the conception of oneself as a being apart from God, if carried out to its legitimate consequences, must ultimately land all who hold it in a condition of things where open ferocity or secret cunning, the tiger nature or the serpent nature, can be the only possible rule of action. Thus it is that the principle of the present age can have no part in that principle of the perfect wholeness which the great master embodied in his teaching and in himself. The two ideas are absolutely incompatible. And whichever we adopt as our leading principle, it must be to the entire exclusion of the other. We cannot serve God and Mammon. There is no such thing as a partial wholeness. Either we are still in the principle of separateness, and our eyes are not yet open to the real nature of the kingdom of heaven, or else we have grasped the principle of unity without any exception anywhere, and the one being includes all, the body and the soul alike, the visible form and the invisible substance and life of all equally. Nothing can be left out, and we stand complete here and now, lacking no faculty, but requiring only to become conscious of our own powers, and to learn to have confidence in them through having them exercised by reason of use. The following communication from a foreign reader commenting on the number of the beast as treated by Judge Troward in Separation and Unity is taken from Expression for 1902, in which it was first published. Following is Judge Troward's reply to this letter. Dear Mr. Editor, a correspondent in the current number of expression points out of the reference in the book of Revelation to the number 666 as the mark of the beast. Because the trinity of mind, soul, and body, if considered as unity, may be expressed by figures 333, and therefore duality is 333 times 2 equals 666. I think the inverse of the proposition is still more startling, and I should like to point it out. Instead of multiplying, let us try dividing. First of all, take unity as the unit 1 and divide by 3, representing, of course, the same formula, viz. Mind, body, and soul. Expressed by common fraction, it is merely 1/3, which is an incomplete mathematical figure. But take the decimal formula of 1 divided by 3, and we arrive at 0.3 circulating, i.e. 0.3333 on to infinity. In other words, the result of the proposition by mathematics is that you divide this formula of spirit, soul, and body into unity, and it remains true to itself ad infinitum. Now we come to consider it as a duality in the same way. Expressed as a vulgar fraction, it is 2/3, but as a decimal fraction, it is 0.6666 ad infinitum. I think this is worth noting. Yours very faithfully, a foreign reader. Brussels, August 14, 1902. Dear Editor, I return with many thanks the very interesting letter received with yours, and I am very glad that my article should have been instrumental in drawing forth this further light on the subject. This, moreover, affords an excellent illustration of one great principle of unity, which is that the unity repeats itself in every one of its parts, so that each part taken separately is an exact reproduction in principles of the greater unity of which it is a portion. Therefore, if you take the individual man as your unit, which is what I did, and proceed by multiplication, you get the results which were pointed out in my article. And conversely, if you take the great unity of all being as your unit, and proceed by division, you arrive at the results shown by your foreign correspondent. The principle is a purely mathematical one, and is extremely interesting in the present application as showing the existence of a system of concealed mathematics running through the whole Bible. This bears out what I said in my article that there were other applications of the principle in question, though this one did not at the time occur to me. I am such indebted to your correspondent for the further proof thus given of the correctness of my interpretation of the number of the beast. Both our interpretations support each other, for they are merely different ways of stating the same thing, and they have this advantage over those generally given, that they do not refer to any particular form of evil, but express a general principle applicable to all alike. Yours sincerely, T. London, August 30, 1902. It may perhaps emphasize my point if I remind my readers that it was the conflict between the principles of unity and separation that led to the crucifixion of Jesus. We must distinguish between the charge which really led to his death and merely technical charge on which he was sentenced by the Roman governor. The latter, the charge of opposition to the royal authority of Caesar, has its significance, but it is clear from the Bible record that this was merely formal, the true cause of conviction being contained in the statement that of the chief priest. We have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. The antagonism of the two principles of unity and separation had first been openly manifested on the occasion when Jesus made the memorable declaration, "I and my Father are one." The Jews took up stones to stone him. Then said Jesus unto them, "Many good works have I shown you from my Father. For which of those works do you stone me?" The Jews replied, "For a good work we stone thee not, but for blasphemy, and because thou, being a man, makest thyself God." Jesus said, "Is it not written in your law, I said ye are gods?" If he called them gods, unto whom the word of God came, and the scriptures cannot be broken, say ye of him whom the Father hath sacrificed and sent into the world, Thou blasphemest, because I said, I am the Son of God? Here we have the first open passage of arms between the two opposing principles which led to the scene of Calvary as the final testimony of Jesus to the principle of unity. He died because he maintained the truth, that he was one with the Father. That was the substantive charge on which he was executed. "Art thou the Son of the Blessed?" he was asked by the priestly tribunal, and the answer came clear and unequivocal, "I am." Then said the council, "He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses?" And they all condemned him to be worthy of death. Jesus did not enter a palpably useless argument with judges whose minds were so rooted in the idea of dualism as to be impervious to any other conception, but with a mixed multitude who were not officially committed to a system. The case was different. Among them there might be some still open to conviction, and the appeal was, therefore, made to a passage in the Psalms with which they were all familiar, pointing out that the very persons to whom the divine word was addressed were styled gods by the divine speaker himself. The incontrovertibleness of the fact was emphasized by the stress laid upon it as scripture which cannot be broken, and the meaning to be assigned to the statement was rendered clear by the argument which Jesus deduced from it. He says, in effect, "You would stone me as a blasphemer for saying of myself what your own scriptures say concerning each of you." The claim of unity with the Father, he urges, was no unique one, but one which the scripture rightly understood, entitled every one of his hearers to make for himself. And so we find throughout that Jesus nowhere makes any claim for himself which he does not also make for those who accept his teaching. Does he say to the Jews, "Ye are of this world, I am not of this world"? Equally he says of his disciples, "They are not of the world, even as I am not of the world." Does he say, "I am the light of the world"? Equally he says, "Ye are the light of the world." Does he say, "I and my Father are one"? Equally he prays that they all might be one even as we are one. Is he styled the Son of God? Then St. John writes, "To them gave he power to become sons of God, even to as many as believe on his name." And by belief on the name, we may surely understand belief in the principle of which the name is the verbal representation. The essential unity of God and man is thus the one fact which permeates the whole teaching of Jesus. He himself stood forth as its living expression. He appealed to his miracles as the proofs of it. It is the Father that doeth the works. It formed the substance of his final discourse with his disciples in the night that he was betrayed. It is the truth, to bear witness to which, he told Pilate, was the purpose of his life. In support of this truth he died, and by the living power of this truth he rose again. The whole object of his mission was to teach men to realize their unity with God and the consequences that must necessarily follow from it, to draw them away from that notion of dualism which puts an impassable barrier between God and man, and thus renders any true conception of the principle of life impossible, and to draw them into the clear perception of the innermost nature of life, as consisting in the inherent identity of each individual with the infinite all-pervading spirit of life, which he called the Father. The branch cannot bear fruit except it abide in the vine. The power of bearing fruit, of producing and of giving forth, depends entirely on the fact that the individual is and always continues to be as much an organic part of the universal spirit as the fruit-bearing branch is an organic part of the parent stem. Lose this idea and regard God as merely external creator who may indeed command us or even sometimes be moved by our cries and entreaties, and we have lost the root of livingness and with it all possibility of growth or of liberty. This is dualism, which cuts us off from our source of life. And so long as we take this false conception for the true law of being, we shall find ourselves hampered by limitations and insoluble problems of every description. We have lost the key of life and are consequently unable to open the door. But in proportion as we abide in the vine, that is, consciously realize our perpetual unity with originating spirit, and impress upon ourselves that this unity is neither bestowed as the reward of merit, nor as an act of favor, which would be to deny the unity, for the bestowal would at once imply dualism, but dwell on the truth that it is the innermost and supreme principle of our own nature. In proportion as we consciously realize this, we shall rise to greater and greater certainty of knowledge, resulting in more and more perfect externalization whose increasing splendor can know no limits, for it is the continual outflowing of the exhaustless spirit of life in that manifestation of itself, which is our own individuality. The notion of dualism is the veil which prevents men seeing this, and causes them to wander blindfolded among the mazes of endless perplexity. But as St. Paul truly says, when this veil is taken away, we shall find ourselves changed from glory to glory, as by the Lord the Spirit. His name shall be called Emmanuel, that is, God in us. Not a separate being from ourselves. Let us remember that Jesus was condemned by the principle of separation because he himself was the externalization of the principle of unity, and that, in adhering to the principle of unity, we are adhering to the only possible root of life, and are maintaining the truth for which Jesus died. End of chapter. Chapter 17. Externalization. Who would not be happy in himself and his conditions? That is what we all desire, more fullness of life, a greater and brighter vitality in ourselves, and less restriction in our surroundings. And we are told that the talisman by which this can be accomplished is thought. We are told, change your modes of thought, and the changed conditions will follow. But many seekers feel that this is very much like telling us to catch birds by putting salt on their tails. If we can put the salt on the bird's tail, we can also lay our hand on the bird. If we can change our thinking, we can thereby change our circumstances. But how are we going to bring about this change of cause, which will in turn produce this changed effect? This is the practical question that perplexes many earnest seekers. They can see their way clearly enough through the whole sequence of cause and effect resulting in the externalization of the desired result if only the one initial difficulty could be got over. The difficulty is a real one, and until it is overcome, it vitiates all the teaching and reduces it to a mere paper theory. Therefore, it is to this point that the attention of students should be particularly directed. They feel the need of some solid basis from which the change of thought can be effected, and until they find this, the theory of divine science, however perfect in itself, will remain for them nothing more than a mere theory, producing no practical results. The necessary scientific basis exists, however, and is extremely simple and reasonable, if we will take the pains to think it out carefully for ourselves. Unless we are prepared to support the theses that the power which created the universe is inherently evil, or that the universe is the work of two opposite and equal powers, one evil and the other good, both of which propositions are demonstrably false, we have no alternative but to say that the originating source of all must be inherently good. It cannot be partly good and partly evil, for that would be to set it against itself and make it self-destructive. Therefore, it must be good altogether. But once grant this initial proposition and we cut away the root of all evil. For how can evil proceed from an all-originating source which is good altogether, and in which, therefore, no germ for the development of evil is to be found? Good cannot be the origin of evil. And since nothing can proceed except from the one originating mind, which is only good, the true nature of all things must be that which they have received from their source, namely good. Hence it follows that evil is not the true nature of anything, and that evil must have its rise in something external to the true nature of things. And since evil is not in the true nature of the things themselves, nor yet in the universal mind, which is the originating principle, there remains only one place for it to spring from, and that is our personal thought. First, we suppose evil to be as inherent in the nature of things as good, a supposition which we could not make if we stopped to consider the necessary nature of the originating principle. Then, on this entirely gratuitous supposition, we proceed to build up a fabric of fears, which of course follow logically from it. And so we nourish and give substance to the negative, or that which has no substantial existence except such as we attribute to it, until we come to regard it as having affirmative power of its own, and so set up a false idea of being, the product of our own minds, to dispute the claims of true being to the sovereignty of the universe. Once assume the existence of two rival powers, one good and the other evil, in the direction of the universe, and any sense of harmony becomes impossible. The whole course of nature is thrown out of gear, and whether for ourselves or for the world at large, there remains no ground of certainty anywhere. And this is precisely the condition in which the majority of people live. They are surrounded by infinite uncertainty about everything, and are consequently a prey to continual fears and anxieties. And the only way of escape from this state of things is to go to the root of the matter and realize that the whole fabric of evil originates in our own inverted conception of the nature of being. But if we once realize that the true conception of being necessarily excludes the very idea of evil, we shall see that, in giving way to thoughts and fears of evil, we are giving substance to that which has no real substance in itself, and are attributing to the negative an affirmative force which it does not possess. In fact, we are creating the very thing we fear. And the remedy for this is always to recur to the original nature of being as altogether good, and then to speak to ourselves thus: my thought must continually externalize something, for that is its inherent quality, which nothing can ever alter. Shall I, then, externalize God or the opposite of God? Which do I wish to see manifested in my life, good or its opposite? Shall I manifest what I know to be the reality or the reverse? Then comes the steady resolve always to manifest God or good, because that is the only true reality in all things. And this resolve is with power because it is founded upon the solid rock of truth. We must refuse to know evil. We must refuse to admit that there is any such thing to be known. It is the converse of this which is symbolized in the story of the fall. In the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. It was never spoken of the knowledge of good, for good never brought death into the world. It is eating the fruit of the tree of a so-called knowledge which admits a second branch, the knowledge of evil, that is the source of death. Admit that evil has a substantive entity which renders it a subject of knowledge, and you thereby create it, with all its consequences of sorrow, sickness, and death. But be sure that the Lord, He is God, that is, that the one and only ruling principle of the universe, whether within us or around us, is good and good only, and evil with all its train sinks back into its original nothingness, and we find that the truth has made us free. We are free to externalize what we will, whether in ourselves or our surroundings, for we have found the solid basis on which to make the needed change of mental attitude in the fact that the good is the only reality of being. End of chapter. Chapter 18. Entering into the spirit of it. Entering into the spirit of it. What a common expression. And yet how much it really means. How absolutely everything. We enter into the spirit of an undertaking, into the spirit of a movement, into the spirit of an author, even into the spirit of a game. And it makes all the difference both to us and to that into which we enter. A game without any spirit is a poor affair, and association in which there is no spirit falls to pieces. And a spiritless undertaking is sure to be a failure. On the other hand, the book which is meaningless to the unsympathizing reader is full of life and suggestion to the one who enters into the spirit of the writer. The man who enters into the spirit of the music finds a spring of refreshment in some fine recital which is entirely missed by the cold critic who comes only to judge according to the standard of a rigid rule. And so on in every case that we can think of. If we do not enter the spirit of a thing, it has no invigorating effect upon us, and we regard it as dull, insipid, and worthless. This is our everyday experience, and these are the words in which we express it, and the words are well chosen. They show our intuitive recognition of the spirit as the fundamental reality in everything, however small or however great. Let us be right as to the spirit of a thing, and everything else will successfully follow. By entering into the spirit of anything, we establish a mutual vivifying action and reaction between it and ourselves. We vivify it with our own vitality, and it vivifies us with a living interest which we call its spirit. And therefore, the more fully we enter into the spirit of all with which we are concerned, the more thoroughly do we become alive. The more completely we do this, the more we shall find that we are penetrating into the great secret of life. It may seem a truism, but the great secret of life is its livingness, and it is just more of this quality of livingness that we want to get a hold of. It is that good thing of which we can never have too much. But every fact implies also its negative, and we never properly understand a thing until we not only know what it is, but also clearly understand what it is not. To a complete understanding, the knowledge of the negative is as necessary as the knowledge of the affirmative, for the perfect knowledge consists in realizing the relation between the two, and the perfect power grows out of this knowledge by enabling us to balance the affirmative and negative against each other in any proportion that we will, thus giving flexibility to what would otherwise be too rigid and form to what would otherwise be too fluid. And so, by uniting these two extremes, to produce any result we may desire. It is the old Hermetic saying, coagula et solve, solidify the fluid and dissolve the solid. And therefore, if we would discover the secret of entering into the spirit of it, we must get some idea of the negative, which is the not spirit. In various ages, this negative phase has been expressed in different forms of words suitable to the spirit of the time. And so, clothing this idea in the attire of the present day, I will sum up the opposite of spirit in the word mechanism. Before all things, this is a mechanical age, and it is astonishing how great a part of what we call our social advance has its root in the mechanical arts. Reduce the mechanical arts to what they were in the days of the Plantagenets, and the greater part of our boasted civilization would recede through the centuries along with them. We may not be conscious of all this, but the mechanical tendency of the age has a firm grip upon society at large. We habitually look at the mechanical side of things by preference to any other. Everything is done mechanically, from the carving on a piece of furniture to the arrangement of the social system. It is the mechanism that must be considered first, and the spirit has to be fitted to the mechanical exigencies. We enter into the mechanism of it instead of into the spirit of it, and so limit the spirit and refuse to let it have its own way. And then, as a consequence, we get entirely mechanical action and complete our circle of ignorance by supposing that this is the only sort of action there is. Yet this is not a necessary state of things, even in regard to physical science, for the men who have made the greatest advances in that direction are those who have most clearly seen the subordination of the mechanical to the spiritual. The man who can recognize a natural law only as it operates through certain forms of mechanism with which he is familiar will never rise to the construction of the higher forms of mechanism which might be built upon that law. For he fails to see that it is the law which determines the mechanism and not vice versa. This man will make no advance in science, either theoretical or applied, and the world will never owe any debt of gratitude to him. But the man who recognizes that the mechanism for the application of any principle grows out of the true apprehension of the principle studies the principle first, knowing that when that is properly grasped, it will necessarily suggest all that is wanted for bringing it into practical use. And if this is true in regard to so-called physical science, it is a fortiori true as regards the science of spirit. There is a mechanical attitude of mind which judges everything by the limitations of past experiences, allowing nothing for the fact that those experiences were for the most part the result of our ignorance of spiritual law. But if we realize the true law of being, we shall rise above these mechanical conceptions. We shall not deny the reality of the body or of the physical world as facts, knowing that they also are spirit, but we shall learn to deny their power as causes. We shall learn to distinguish between the causa causta and causa causans, the secondary or apparent physical cause and the primary or spiritual cause, without which the secondary cause could not exist. And so we shall get a new standpoint of clear knowledge and certain power by stepping over the threshold of the mechanical and entering into the spirit of it. What we have to do is to maintain our even balance between the two extremes, denying neither spirit nor the mechanism which is its form and through which it works. The one is as necessary to a perfect whole as the other, for there must be an outside as well as an inside. Only we must remember that the creative principle is always inside, and that the outside only exhibits what the inside creates. Hence, whatever external effect we would produce, we must first enter into the spirit of it and work upon the spiritual principle, whether in ourselves or others, and by so doing our insight will become greatly enlarged. For from without, we can see only one small portion of the circumference, while from the center, we can see the whole of it. If we fully grasp the truth that spirit is creator, we can dispense with painful investigations into the mechanical side of all our problems. If we are constructing from without, then we have to calculate anxiously the strength of our materials and the force of every thrust and strain to which they may be subjected. And very possibly, after all, we may find that we have made a mistake somewhere in our elaborate calculations. But if we realize the power of creating from within, we shall find all these calculations correctly made for us. For the same Spirit which is Creator is also that which the Bible calls the wonderful numberer. Construction from without is based upon analysis, and no analysis is complete without accurate quantitative knowledge. But creation is the very opposite of analysis and carries its own mathematics with it. To enter into the spirit of anything, then, is to make yourself one in thought with the creative principle that is at the center of it. And therefore, why not go to the center of all things at once and enter into the spirit of life? Do you ask where to find it? In yourself. And in proportion as you find it there, you will find it everywhere else. Look at life as the one thing that is, whether in you or around you. Try to realize the livingness of it, and then seek to enter into the spirit of it by affirming it to be the whole of what you are. Affirm this continually in your thoughts, and by degrees the affirmation will grow into a real living force within you, so that it will become a second nature to you, and you will find it impossible and unnatural to think in any other way. And the nearer you approach this point, the greater you will find your control over both body and circumstances, until at last you shall so enter into the spirit of it, into the spirit of the divine creative power, which is the root of all things. That, in the word of Jesus, nothing shall be impossible to you, because you have so entered into the spirit of it that you discover yourself to be one with it. Then all the old limitations will have passed away, and you will be living in an entirely new world of life, liberty, and love, of which you yourself are the radiating center. You will realize the truth that your thought is a limitless creative power, and that you yourself are behind your thought, controlling and directing it with knowledge for any purpose which love motives and wisdom plans. Thus you will cease from your labors, your struggles, and anxieties, and enter into that new order where perfect rest is one with ceaseless activity. End of chapter. Chapter 19, The Bible and the New Thought. The Sun. A deeply interesting subject to the student of the New Thought movement is to trace how exactly its teaching is endorsed by the teaching of the Bible. There is no such thing as new thought in the sense of new truth, for what is truth now must have been truth always. But there is such a thing as a new presentment of the old truth, and it is in this that the newness of the present movement consists. But the same truth has been repeatedly stated in earlier ages under various forms and in various measures of completeness, and nowhere more completely than in the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments. None of the older forms of statement is more familiarly known to our readers than that contained in the Bible, and no other is entwined around our hearts with the same sacred and tender associations. Therefore, I have no hesitation in saying that the existence of a marked correspondence between its teaching and that of the New Thought cannot but be a source of strength and encouragement to any of us who have been accustomed in the past to look to the old and hallowed book as a storehouse of divine wisdom. We shall find that the clearer light will make the rough places smooth and the dim places luminous, and that of the treasures of knowledge hidden in the ancient volume the half has not been told us. The Bible lays emphatic stress upon the glorious liberty of the sons of God, thus uniting in a single phrase the twofold idea of filial dependence and personal liberty. A careful study of the subject will show thus that there is no opposition between these two ideas, but that they are necessary correlatives to each other, and that whether stated after the more concentrated method of the Bible or after the more detailed method of the New Thought, the true teaching proclaims not our independence of God, but our independence in God. Such an inquiry naturally centers in an especial manner around the sayings of Jesus. For whatever may be our opinions as to the nature of the authority with which he spoke, we must all agree that a peculiar weight attaches to those utterances which have come down to us as the ipsissima verba from which the entire New Testament has been developed. And if an identity of conception in the New Thought movement can be traced here at the fountainhead, we may expect to find it in the lower streams also. The key to the Master's teaching is to be found in his discourse with the women of Samaria, and it is contained in the statement that the Father is Spirit, that is, Spirit in the absolute and unqualified sense of the word, as appears from the original Greek, and not a spirit as it is rendered in the authorized version. And then as the natural correlative to the Father, we find another term employed, the Son. The relation between these two forms the great subject of Jesus' teaching, and therefore it is most important to have some definite idea of what he meant by these terms if we would understand what it was that he really taught. Now, if the Father be Spirit, the Son must be Spirit also, for a Son must necessarily be of the same nature as his Father. But since the Father is Spirit, absolute and universal, it is evident that the Son cannot be Spirit, absolute and universal, because there cannot be two universal spirits, for then neither would be universal. We may therefore logically infer that because the Father is universal Spirit, the Son is Spirit, not universal. And the only definition of Spirit not universal is Spirit individualized and particular. The Scripture tells us that the Spirit is life, and taking this as the definition of Spirit, we find that the Father is absolute, originating, undifferentiated life, and the Son is the same life differentiated into particular forms. Hence, in the widest sense of the expression, the Son stands for the whole creation, visible or invisible, and in this sense it is the mere differentiation of the universal life into a multiplicity of particular modes. But if we have any adequate idea of the intelligent and responsive nature of Spirit, if we realize that because it is pure being, it must be infinite intelligence and infinite responsiveness, then we shall see that its reproduction in the particular admits of innumerable degrees, from mere expression as outward form up to the very fullest expression of the infinite intelligence and responsiveness that Spirit is. Footnote: Intelligence and responsiveness is the generic nature of Spirit in every mode, and it is the concentration of this into centers of consciousness that makes personality, i.e., self-conscious individuality. This varies immensely in degree, from its first adumbration in the animal to its intense development in the great masters of spiritual science. Therefore it is called the power that knows itself. It is the power of self-recognition that makes personality, and as we grow to see that our personality is not all contained between our hat and our boots, as Walt Whitman says, but expands away into the infinite, which we then find to be the infinite of ourselves, the same I am that I am, so our personality expands and we become conscious of ever-increasing degrees of life in ourselves. End of footnote. The teachings of Jesus were addressed to the hearts and intelligences of men, and therefore the grade of sonship of which he spoke has reference to the expression of infinite being in the human heart and intellect. But this, again, may be conceived of in infinite degrees. In some men, there is the bare potentiality of sonship entirely undeveloped as yet. In others, the beginnings of its development, in others, a fuller development, and so on, until we can suppose some supreme instance in which the absolutely perfect reproduction of the universal has been attained. Each of these stages constitutes a fuller and fuller expression of sonship, until the supreme development reaches a point at which it can be described only as the perfect image of the Father. And this is the logical result of a process of steady growth from an inward principle of life which constitutes the identity of each individual. It is thus a necessary inference from Jesus' own explanation of the Father as spirit or infinite being that the Son is the scriptural phrase for the reproduction of infinite being in the individual, contemplated in that stage at which the individual does in some measure begin to recognize his identity with his originating source, or at any rate where he has capacity for such a recognition, even though the actual recognition may not yet have taken place. It is very remarkable that, thus defining the Son on the direct statement of Jesus himself, we arrive exactly at the definition of spirit as that power which knows itself. In the capacity for thus recognizing its identity of nature with the Father, is it that the potential fact of sonship consists. For the prodigal son was still a son even before he began to realize his relation to his father in actual fact. It is the dawning of this recognition that constitutes the spiritual babe, or infant son, and by degrees this consciousness grows till he attains the full estate of spiritual manhood. This recognition by the individual of his own identity with universal spirit is precisely what forms the basis of the new thought, and thus, at the outset, the two systems radiate from a common center. But I suppose the feature of the new thought which is the greatest stumbling block to those who view the movement from the outside is the claim that it makes for thought power as an active factor in the affairs of daily life. As a mere set of speculative opinions, people might be willing to pigeonhole it along with the philosophic systems of Kant or Hegel. But it is the practical element in it which causes the difficulty. It is not only a system of thought based upon a conception of the unity of being, but it claims to follow out this conception to its legitimate consequences in the production of visible and tangible external results by the mere exercise of thought power. A ridiculous claim, a claim not to be tolerated by common sense, a trespassing upon the divine prerogative, a claim of unparalleled audacity. Thus the casual objector. But this claim is not without its parallel, for the same claim was put forward on the same ground by the great teacher himself as the proper result of the Son's recognition of his relation to the Father. Ask what you will, and it shall be done unto you. Whatsoever you shall ask in prayer, believing, you shall receive, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. All things are possible to him that believeth. These statements are absolutely without any note of limitation, save that imposed by the seeker's want of faith in his own power to move the infinite. This is as clear a declaration of the efficacy of mental power to produce outward and tangible results as any now made by the new thought, and it is made on precisely the same ground, namely the readiness of the Father or Spirit in the universal to respond to the movement of spirit in the individual. In the Bible, this movement of individualized spirit is called prayer, and it is synonymous with thought, formulated with the intention of producing this response. Prayer is the heart's sincere desire, uttered or unexpressed. And we must not let ourselves be misled by the association of particular forms with particular words, but should follow the sound advice of Oliver Wendell Holmes and submit such words to a process of depolarization which brings out their real meaning. Whether we call our act prayer or thought concentration, we mean the same thing. It is the claim of the man to move the infinite by the action of his own mind. It may be objected, however, that this definition omits an important element of prayer, the question, namely, whether God will hear it. But this is the very element that Jesus most rigorously excludes from his description of the mental act. Prayer, according to the popular notion, is a most uncertain matter. Whether we shall be heard or not depends entirely upon another will, regarding whose actions we are completely ignorant, and therefore, according to this notion, the very essence of prayer consists of utter uncertainty. Jesus' conception of prayer was the very opposite. He bids us believe that we have already in fact received what we ask for, and makes this the condition of receiving. In other words, he makes the essential factor in the mental action to consist in absolute certainty as to the corresponding response in the infinite, which is exactly the condition that the new thought lays down for a successful operation of thought power. It may, however, be objected that if men have thus an indiscriminate power of projecting their thought to the accomplishment of anything they desire, they can do so for evil as easily as for good. But Jesus fully recognized this possibility and worked the only destructive miracle recorded of him for the express purpose of emphasizing the danger. The reason given by the compilers of the gospel for the destruction of the fig tree is clearly inadequate, for we certainly cannot suppose Jesus so unreasonable as to curse a tree for not bearing fruit out of season. But the record itself shows a very different purpose. Jesus answered the disciples' astonished question by telling them that it was in their own power not only to do what was done for the fig tree, but to produce effects upon a far grander scale. And he concludes the conversation by laying down the duty of a heart-searching forgiveness as a necessary preliminary to prayer. Why was this precept so particularly impressed in this particular connection? Obviously because the demonstration he had just given of the valency of thought power in the hands of instructed persons laid bare the fact that this power can be used destructively as well as beneficially, and that, therefore, a thorough heart-searching for the eradication of any lurking ill feeling became an imperative preliminary to its safe use. Otherwise, there was a danger of noxious thought currents being set in motion to the injury of others. The miracle of the fig tree was an object lesson to exhibit the need for the careful handling of that limitless power which Jesus assured his disciples existed as fully in them as in himself. I do not here attempt to go into this subject in detail, but enough has, I think, been shown to convince us that Jesus made exactly the same claim for the power of thought as that made by the New Thought movement at the present day. It is a great claim, and it is therefore encouraging to find such an authority committed to the same assertion. The general principle on which this claim is based by the exponents of the New Thought is the identity of spirit in the individual with spirit in the universal. And we shall find that this also is the basis of Jesus' teaching on the subject. He says that the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he seeth the Father do, these things doeth the Son in like manner. It must now be sufficiently clear that the Son is a generic appellation, not restricted to a particular individual, but applicable to all, and this statement explains the manner of the Son's working in relation to the Father. The point this sentence particularly emphasizes is that it is what he sees the Father doing that the Son does also. His doing corresponds to his seeing. If the seeing expands, the doing expands along with it. But we are all sufficiently familiar with this principle in other matters. What differentiates an Edison or a Marconi from the apprentice who knows only how to fit up an electric bell by rule of thumb? It is their capacity for seeing the universal principles of electricity and bringing them into particular application. The greater painter is the one who sees the universal principles of form and color, where the smaller man sees only a particular combination. And so, the great surgeon, the great chemist, the great lawyer, in every line it is the power of insight that distinguishes the great man from the little one. It is the capacity for making wide generalizations and perceiving far-reaching laws that raises the exceptional mind above the ordinary level. The greater working always results from the greater seeing into the abstract principles from which any art or science is generated. And this same law carried up to the universal principles of life is the law by which the Son's working is proportioned to his seeing, the method of the Father's work. Thus, the source of the Son's power lies in the contemplation of the Father. The endeavor, that is, to realize the true nature of being, whether in the abstract or in its generic forms of manifestation. This is Bacon's maxim, work as God works. And similarly, the New Thought consists before all things in the realization of the laws of being. And the result of the seeing is that the Son does the same things as the Father in like manner. The Son's action is the reproduction of the universal principles in application to specific instances. Footnote: everything depends on this principle of reciprocity. By contemplation, we come to realize the true nature of Spirit, or the Father. We learn to disengage the variable factors of particular modes from the invariable factors which are the essential qualities of Spirit underlying all modes. Then, when we realize these essential qualities, we see that we can apply them under any mode that we will. In other words, we supply the variable factor of the combination by the action of our thought, as desire or will, and thus combine it with the invariable factor or constant of the essential law of Spirit, thus producing what result we will. This is just what we do in respect to physical nature, e.g., the electrician supplies the variable factor of the particular mode of application, and the constant laws of electricity respond to the nature of the invitation given to them. These responsiveness is inherent in Spirit. Otherwise, Spirit would have no means of expansion into manifestation. Responsiveness is the principle of Spirit's self-expression. We do not have to create response action on the part of electricity. We can safely take this responsiveness for granted as pure natural law. Our desire first works on the rupa level and thence concentrates itself through the various rupa levels till it reaches complete external manifestation. End of footnote. The principles remain unaltered and work always in the same manner, and the office of the Son is to determine the particular field of their operation with regard to the specific object which he has in view, and therefore, so far as that object is concerned, the action of the Son becomes the action of the Father also. Again, there is no concealment on the part of the Father. He has no secrets, for the Father loveth the Son, and showeth him all things that himself doeth. There is perfect reciprocity between Spirit in the universal and in the individualization, resulting from the identity of being. And the Son's recognition of love as the active principle of this unity gives him an intuitive insight into all those inner workings of the universal life, which we call the arcana of nature. Love has a divine gift of insight which cannot be attained by intellect alone. And the old saying, "Love will find out the way," has greater depths of meaning than appear on the surface. Thus there is not only a seeing, but also a showing, and the three terms, looking, seeing, showing, combine to form a power of working to which it is impossible to assign any limit. Here again, the teaching of Jesus is in exact correspondence with that of the New Thought, which tells us that limitations exist only where we ourselves put them, and that to view ourselves as being of limitless knowledge, power, and love is to become such an outward manifestation of visible fact. Any objection, therefore, to the New Thought teaching regarding the possibilities latent in man apply with equal force to the teachings of Jesus. His teaching clearly was that the perfect individuality of man is a dual unity, the polarization of the infinite in the manifest, and it requires only the recognition of this truth for the manifested element in this binary system to demonstrate its identity with the corresponding element which is not externally visible. He said that he and his Father were one, that those who had seen him had seen the Father, that the words which he spoke were the Father's, and that it was the Father who did the works. Nothing could be more explicit. Absolute unity of the manifested individuality with the originating infinite Spirit is asserted or implied in every utterance attributed to Jesus, whether spoken of himself or of others. He recognizes only one radical difference: the difference between those who know this truth and those who do not know it. The distinction between the disciple and the master is one only of degree, which will be affected by the expansive power of growth. The disciple, when he is perfected, shall be as his master. All that hinders the individual from exercising the full power of the infinite for any purpose whatever is his lack of faith. his inability to realize to the full the stupendous truth that he himself is the very power which he seeks. This was the teaching of Jesus as it is that of the New Thought. And this truth of the divine sonship of man, once taken as the great foundation, a magnificent edifice of possibilities, which eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, neither had entered into the heart of man to conceive, grows up logically upon it, a glorious heritage which each one may legitimately claim in right of his common humanity. The Great Affirmation. I take it for granted that my readers are well acquainted with the part assigned to the principle of affirmation in the scheme of the New Thought. This is often a stumbling block to beginners, and I feel sure that even those who are not beginners will welcome every aid to a deeper apprehension of this great central truth. I therefore purpose to examine the Bible teaching on this important subject. The professed object of the Bible is to establish and extend the kingdom of God throughout the world, and this can be done only by repeating the process from one individual to another until the whole mass is leavened. It is thus an individual process. And as we have seen in the last chapter, God is spirit and spirit is life, and therefore the expansion of the kingdom of God means the expansion of the principle of life in each individual. Now life, to be life at all, must be affirmative. It is life in virtue of what it is, and not in virtue of what it is not. The quantity of life in any particular case may be very small, but however small the amount, the quality is always the same. It is the quality of being, the quality of livingness, and not its absence that makes it what it is. The distinctive character of life, therefore, is that it is positive and not negative, and every degree of negativeness, that is, every limitation, is ultimately traceable to deficiency of life power. Limitations surround us because we believe in our inability to do what we desire. Whenever we say, I cannot, we are brought up sharp by a limitation, and we cease to exercise our thought power in that direction because we believe ourselves stopped by a blank wall of impossibility. And whenever this occurs, we are subjected to bondage. The ideal of perfect liberty is the converse of all this, and follows a sequence which does not thus lead us into a cul-de-sac. This sequence consists of 3 affirmations. I am, therefore I can, therefore I will. And this last affirmation results in the projection of our powers, whether interior or external, to the accomplishment of the desired object. But this last affirmation has its root in the first, and it is because we recognize the affirmative nature of the life that is in us, or rather of the life which we are, that the power to will or to act positively has any existence, and therefore the extent of our power to will and to act positively and with effect is exactly measured by our perception of the depth and livingness of our own being. Hence, the more fully we learn to affirm that, the greater power we are able to exercise. Now, the ideal of perfect liberty is the entire absence of all limitation, and to have no limitation in being is to be coextensive with all being. We are all grammarians enough to know that the use of a predicate is to lead the mind to contemplate the subject as represented by that predicate. In other words, it limits our conception for the time being to that particular aspect of the subject. Hence, every predicate, however extensive, implies some limitation of the subject. But the ideal subject, the absolute free self, is, by the very hypothesis, without limitation, and therefore no predicate can be attached to it. It stands as a declaration of its own being without any statement of what that being consists in. And therefore it says of itself, not I am this or that, but simply, I am. No predicate can be added, because the only commensurate predicate would be the enumeration of infinity. Therefore, both logically and grammatically, the only possible statement of a fully liberated being is made in the words, I am. I need hardly remind my readers of the frequency with which Jesus employed these emphatic words. In many cases, the translators have added the word he, but they have been careful by putting it in italics to show that it is not in the original. As grammarians and theologians, they thought something more was wanted to complete the sense, and they supplied it accordingly. But if we would get at the very words as the Master himself spoke them, we must strike out this interpolation, and as soon as we have done so, there flashes into light the identity of his statement with that made to Moses at the burning bush, where the full significance of the words is so obvious that the translators were compelled to leave the place of the predicate in that seeming emptiness which comes from filling all things. Seen thus, a marvelous light shines forth from the instruction of the great teacher. For in whatever sense we may regard him as a great exception to the weak and limited aspect of humanity with which we are only too familiar, we must all agree that his mission was not to render mankind hopeless by declaring the path of advance barred against them, but to give light to them that sit in darkness, and liberty to them that are bound, by proclaiming the unlimited possibilities that are in man, waiting only to be called forth by knowledge of the truth. And if we suppose any personal reference in his words, it can, therefore, be only as the great example of what man has it in him to become, and not as the example of something which man can never hope to be. An exception, truly, to mankind as we see them now, but the exception that proves the rule and sets the standard of what each one may become as he attains to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Let us therefore, by striking out this interpolation, restore the Master's words as they stand in the original. Except ye believe that I am, ye shall die in your sins. This is an epitome of his teaching. The last enemy that shall be overcome is death, and the sting or fatal power of death is sin. Remove that, and death has no longer any dominion over us. Its power is at an end. And the strength of sin is the law. Sin is every contradiction of the law of being, and the law of being is infinitude. For being is life, and life in its innermost essence is the limitless I am. Dying in our sins is thus not a punishment for doubting a particular theological dogma, but it is the unavoidable natural consequence of not realizing, not believing in the I am. So long as we fail to realize its full infinitude in ourselves, we cut ourselves off from our conscious unity with the infinite life spirit which permeates all things. Without this principle, we have no alternative but to die, and this because of our sin, that is, because of our failure to conform to the true law of our being, which is life and not death. We affirm death and negation concerning ourselves, and therefore death and negation are externalized. And thus we pay the penalty of not believing in the central law of our own life, which is the law of all life. The Bible is the book of principles, and therefore by dying is meant the acceptance of the principle of the negative, which culminates in death as the sum total of all limitations, and which introduces at every step those restrictions which are of the nature of death, because their tendency is to curtail the outflowing fullness of life. This then is the very essence of the teaching of Jesus, that unbelief in the limitless power of the life in ourselves, in each of us, is the one cause of death, and of all those evils which in greater or lesser measure reproduce the restrictive influences which deprive life of its fullness and joy. If we would escape death and enter into life, we must each believe in the I am in ourselves. And the ground for this belief? Simply that nothing else is conceivable. If our life is not a portion of the life of the universal spirit, whence comes it? We are because that is. No other explanation is possible. The unqualified affirmation of our own livingness is not an audacious self-assertion. It is the only logical outcome of the fact that there is any life anywhere, and that we are here to think about it. In the sense of universal being, there can be only one I am, and the understanding use of the words by the individual is the assertion of this fact. The forms of manifestation are infinite, but the life which is manifested is one. And thus every thinker who recognizes the truth regarding himself finds in the I am both himself and the totality of all things. And thus he comes to know that in utilizing the interior nature of the things and persons about him, he is, in effect, employing the powers of his own life. Sometimes the veil which Jesus drew over this great truth was very transparent. To the Samaritan woman, he spoke of it as a spring of life forever welling up in the innermost recesses of man's being. And again, to the multitude assembled at the temple, he spoke of it as a river of life forever gushing from the secret sources of the Spirit within us. Life, to be ours at all, must be ourselves. An energy which only passed through us, without being us, might produce a sort of galvanic activity, but it would not be life. Life can never be a separate entity from the individuality which is defined as to pulsate with what might seem to us an absolutely divine vitality. It would still be no other than the man himself. Thus Jesus directs us to no external source of life, but ever teaches that the kingdom of heaven is within, and that what is wanted is to remove those barriers of ignorance and ill will which prevent us from realizing that the great I am, which is the innermost spirit of life throughout the universe, is the same I am that I am, whoever I may be. On another memorable occasion, Jesus declared again that the I am is the enduring principle of life. It is this that is the resurrection and the life, not as Martha supposed, a new principle to be infused from without at some future time, but an inherent core of vitality, awaiting only its own recognition of itself to triumph over death and the grave. And yet again, hear the Master's answer to the inquiring Thomas. How many of us, like him, desire to know the way, to hear of wonderful powers latent in man and requiring only development is beautiful and hopeful if we could only find out the way to develop them. But who will show us the way? The answer comes with no uncertain note. The I am includes everything. It is at once the way, the truth, and the life. Not the life only, or the truth only, but also the way by which to reach them. Can words be plainer? It is by continually affirming and relying on the I am in ourselves as identical with the I am that is the one and only life, whether manifested or unmanifested, in all places of the universe, that we shall find the way to the attainment of all truth and of all life. Here we have the predicate which we are seeking to complete our affirmation regarding ourselves. I am. What? The three things which include all things. Truth, which is all knowledge and wisdom. Life, which is all power and love. And the unfailing way which will lead us step by step, if we follow it, to heights too sublime and environment too wide for our present juvenile imaginings to picture. As the New Testament centers around Jesus, so the Old Testament centers around Moses, and he also declares the great affirmation to be the same. Footnote: the Old Testament and the New treat the I am from its opposite poles. The Old Testament treats it from the relation of the whole to the part, while the New Testament treats it from the relation of the part to the whole. This is important as explaining the relation between the Old and New Testaments. A. My word shall not return unto me void, but shall accomplish that whereunto I send it. B. The principle here indicated is that of the alternation and equation between absorption and radiation, a taking in before and a giving out. C. Order. Whatever betrays this is disorder. D. Conscious. It is the degree of consciousness that always marks the transition from a lower to a higher power of life. The life of all 7 principles must always be present in us. Otherwise, we should not exist at all. Therefore, it is the degree in which we learn to consciously function in each of them that marks our advance into higher kingdoms within ourselves and frequently outside ourselves also. E. The central radiating point of our individuality is one with all being. F. Equilibrium. Note the difference between the living equilibrium of alternate rhythmic pulsation, the whole pulsation doctrine, and the dead equilibrium of merely running down to a dead level. The former implies the doctrine of the return, the upward arc compensating the downward arc. The deadness of the latter results from the absence of any such compensation. The upward arc results from the contemplation of the highest ideal. G. Spirit cannot leave any portion of its nature behind it. It must always have all the qualities of spirit in it, even though the lower parts of the individuality are not yet conscious of it. H. The great affirmation is the guide to the whole subject. End of footnote. For him, God has no name, but that intensely living universal life which is all in all, and no name is sufficient to be its equivalent. The emphatic words, I am, are the only possible statement of the one power which exhibits itself as all worlds and all living beings. It is the great I am which forever unfolds itself in all the infinite evolutionary forces of the cosmic scheme, and which, in marvelous onward march, develops itself into higher and higher conscious intelligence in the successive races of mankind, unrolling the scroll of history as it moves on from age to age, working out with unerring precision the steady forward movement of the whole towards that ultimate perfection in which the work of God will be completed. But stupendous as is the scale on which this providential power reveals itself to Moses and to the prophets, it is still nothing else than the very same power which Jesus bids us realize in ourselves. The theater of its operations may be expanded to the magnificent proportions of a world history, or contracted to the sphere of a single individuality. The difference is only one of scale, but the life principle is always the same. It is always the principle of confident affirmation in the calm knowledge that all things are but manifestations of itself, and that therefore all must move together in one mighty unity which admits of no discordant elements. This unity of the Spirit, once clearly grasped, to say I am is to send the vibrations of our thought currents throughout the universe to do our bidding when and where we will. And, conversely, it is to draw in the vitalizing influence of infinite Spirit as from a boundless ocean of life, which can never be exhausted and from which no power can hold us back. And all this is so because it is the supreme law of nature. It is not the introduction of a new order, but simply the allowing of the original and only possible order to flow onto its legitimate fulfillment. A divine order, truly, but nowhere shall we find anything that is not divine. And it is to the realization of this divine and living order that it is the purpose of the Bible to lead us. But we shall never realize it around us until we first realize it is within us. We can see God outside only by the light of God inside. And this light increases in proportion as we become conscious of the divine nature of the innermost I am, which is the center of our own individuality. Therefore, it is that Jesus tells us that the I am is the door. It is that central point of our individual being which opens into the whole illimitable life of the infinite. If we would understand the old world precept, know thyself, we must concentrate our thought more and more closely upon our own interior life until we touch its central radiating point, and there we shall find that the door into the infinite is indeed open to us, and that we can pass from the innermost of our own being into the innermost of all being. This is why Jesus spoke of the door as that through which we should pass in and out and find pasture. Pasture, the feeding of every faculty with its proper food, is to be found both on the within and the without. The livingness of life consists in both concentration and externalization. It is not the dead equilibrium of inertia, but the living equilibrium of a vital and rhythmic pulsation. Involution and evolution must forever alternate, and the door of communication between them is the I am, which is the living power in both. Thus it is that the great affirmation is the great secret of life, and that to say I am, with a true understanding of all that it implies, is to place ourselves in touch with all the powers of the infinite. This is the universal and eternal affirmation to which no predicate is attached, and all particular affirmations will be found to be only special differentiations of this all-embracing one. I will this or that particular thing because I know that I can bring it into externalization, and I know that I can because I know that I am. And so we always come back to the great central affirmation of all being. Search the scriptures, and you will find that from first to last they teach only this, that every human soul is an individualization of that universal being, or all spirit, which we call God, and that spirit can never be shorn of its powers, but like fire, which is its symbol, must always be fully and perfectly itself, which is life in all its unlimited fullness. In assigning to affirmation, therefore, the importance which it does, the New Thought movement is at one with the teaching of Jesus and Moses and of the entire Bible. And the reason is clear. There's only one truth, and therefore careful seeking can bring men only to the same truth, whether they be Bible writers or any other. The Bible derives its authority from the inherent truth of the things it tells of, and not vice versa. And if these things be true at all, they would be equally true even though no Bible had ever been written. But taking the great affirmation as our guide, we shall find that the system taught by the Bible is scientific and logical throughout, and therefore any other system which is scientifically true will be found to correspond with it in substance, however it may differ from it in form. And thus, in their statements regarding the power of affirmation, the exponents of the New Thought broach no newfangled absurdity, but only reiterate a truth which has been before the world, though very imperfectly recognized, for thousands of years. The Father. If, as we have seen, the Son is the differentiating principle of spirit, giving rise to innumerable individualities, the Father is the unifying principle by which these innumerable individualities are bound together into one common life, and the necessity for recognizing this great basis of the universal harmony forms the foundation of Jesus' teaching on the subject of worship. Woman, believe me, the hour cometh when neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem shall ye worship the Father. Ye worship that which ye know not. We worship that which we know. For salvation is from the Jews, but the hour cometh, and now is when the true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and truth. A quote from the Revised Version. In these few words, the great teacher sums up the whole subject. He lays particular stress on the kind of worship that he means. It is, before all things, founded upon knowledge. Quote, we worship that which we know, end quote. And it is this knowledge that gives the worship a healthful and life-giving quality. It is not the ignorant worship of wonderment and fear, a mere abasement of ourselves before some vast, vague, unknown power, which may injure us if we do not find out how to propitiate it, but it is a definite act performed with a definite purpose, which means that it is the employment of one of our natural faculties upon its proper object in an intelligent manner, The ignorant Samaritan worship is better than no worship at all, for at least it realizes the existence of some center around which a man's life should revolve, something to prevent the aimless dispersion of his powers for want of a centripetal force to bind them together. And even the crudest notion of prayer, as a mere attempt to induce God to change his mind, is at least a first step towards the truth that full supply for all our needs may be drawn from the infinite. Still, such worship as this is hampered with perplexities and can give only a feeble answer to the atheistical sneer which asks, "What is man, that God should be mindful of him, a momentary atom among unnumbered worlds?" Now the teaching of Jesus throws all these perplexities aside with the single word, knowledge. There is only one true way of doing anything, and that is knowing exactly what it is we want to do, and knowing exactly why we want to do it. All other doing is blundering. We may blunder into the right thing sometimes, but we cannot make this our principle of life to all eternity. And if we have to give up the blunder method eventually, why not give it up now and begin at once to profit by acting according to intelligible principle? The knowledge that the Son, as individualized spirit, has his correlative in the Father as universal spirit affords the clue we need. In whatever way we may attempt to explain it, the fact remains that volition is the fundamental characteristic of spirit. We may speak of conscious or subconscious or superconscious action, but in whatever way we may picture to ourselves the condition of the agent as contemplating his own action, a general purposeful lifeward tendency becomes abundantly evident on any enlarged view of nature, whether seen from without or from within. And we may call this by the general name of volition. But the error we have to avoid is that of supposing volition to take the same form in universal spirit as in individualized spirit. The very term, universal and individual, forbid this, for the universal, as such, to exercise specific volition, concentrating itself upon the details of specific case, would be for it to pass into individualization, and to cease to be the absolute and infinite. It would be no longer the Father, but the Son. It is therefore exactly by not exercising specific volition that the Father continues to be the Father, or the great unifying principle. But the volitional quality is not on this account absent from spirit in the universal, for otherwise whence would that quality appear in ourselves? It is present, but according to the nature of the plane on which it is acting. The universal is not the specific, and everything on the plane of the universal must partake of the nature of that plane. Hence, volition in the Father is not specific, and that which is not specific and individual must be generic. Generic volition, therefore, is that mode of volition which belongs to the universal, and generic volition is tendency. This is the solution of the enigma, and this solution is given not obscurely in Jesus' statement that the Father seeks those true worshippers who worship him in spirit and in truth. For what do we mean by tendency? From the root of tendere, to stretch, it signifies a pushing out in a certain definite direction, the tension of some force seeking to expand itself. What force? The universal life principle, for the spirit is life. In the language of modern science, this seeking on the part of the Father is the expansive pressure of the universal life principle seeking the line of least resistance, along which to flow into the fullest manifestation of individualized life. It is a tendency which will take manifested form according to the degree in which it meets with reception. St. John says, "This is the boldness that we have towards him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he heareth us. And if we know that he heareth us whatsoever we ask, we know that we have the petitions that we have asked of him." From the first book of John, verse 14. Now, according to the popular notion of the will of God, this passage entirely loses its value because it makes everything depend on our asking according to his will. And if we start with the idea of an individual act of the divine volition in each separate case, nothing short of a special revelation continually repeated could inform us what the divine will in each particular instance was. Viewed in this light, this passage is a mere jeering at our incapacity. But when once we realize that the will of God is an invariable law of tendency, we have a clear standard by which to test whether we might rightly expect to get what we desire. We can study this law of tendency as we would any other law, and it is this study that is the essence of true worship. The word worship means to count worthy. To count worthy, that is, of observation. The proverb says that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. More truly, we may say that it is the sincerest worship. Hence, the true worship is the study of the universal life principle, the Father, in its nature and in its modes of action. And when we have thus realized the law of God, the law that is inherent in the nature of infinite being, we shall know that by conforming our own particular action to this generic law, we shall find that this law will in every instance work out the results that we desire. This is nothing more or less miraculous than what occurs in every case of applied science. He only is the true chemist or engineer who, by first learning how to obey the generic tendency of natural laws, is able to command them to the fulfillment of his individual purposes. No other method will succeed. Similarly, with the student of the divine mystery of life, he must first learn the great laws of its generic tendency, and then he will be in a position to apply that tendency to the working of any specific effect he will. Common sense tells us what the law of this tendency must be. The Master taught that a house divided against itself cannot stand, and for the life principle to do anything restrictive of the fullest expansion of life would be for it to act to its own destruction. The test, therefore, in every case, whether our intention falls within the scope of the great law, is this: does it operate for the expansion or for the restriction of life? And according to the answer, we can say positively whether or not our purpose is according to the will of God. Therefore, so long as we work within the scope of this generic will of the Father, we need have no fear of the divine providence as an agency acting adversely to us. We may dismiss this bugbear, for we ourselves are manifestations of the very power which we call the Father. The I Am is one, and so long as we preserve this unity by conforming to the generic nature of the I Am in the universal, it will certainly never destroy the unity by entering upon a specific course of action on its own account. Here then we find the secret of power. It is contained in the true worship of the Father, which is the constant recognition of the life-givingness of originating Spirit, and of the fact that we, as individuals, still continue to be portions of that Spirit, and that therefore the law of our nature is to be perpetually drawing life from the inexhaustible stores of the infinite, not bottles of water of life mixed with other ingredients and labeled for this or that particular purpose, but the full flow of the pure stream itself, which we are free to use for any purpose we desire. Whosoever will, let him take the water of life freely. It is thus that the worship of the Father becomes the central principle of the individual life, not as curtailing our liberty, but as affording the only possible basis for it. As a planetary system would be impossible without a central controlling sun, so harmonious life is impossible without the recognition of infinite Spirit as that power, whose generic tendency serves to control each individual being into its proper orbit. This is the teaching of the Bible, and it is also the teaching of the New Thought, which says that life with all its limitless possibilities is a continual outflow from the infinite, which we may turn in any direction that we desire. But it may be asked, what happens if we go counter to this generic law of Spirit? This is an important question, and I must leave the answer for further consideration. Conclusion. I concluded my last chapter with the momentous question: what happens if we go counter to the generic law of Spirit? What happens if we go counter to any natural law? Obviously, the law goes counter to us. We can use the laws of nature, but we cannot alter them. By opposing any natural law, we place ourselves in an inverted position with regard to it, and therefore, viewed from this false standpoint, it appears as though the law itself were working against us with definite purpose. But the inversion proceeds entirely from ourselves, and not from any change in the action of the law. The law of spirit, like all other natural laws, is in itself impersonal, but we carry into it, so to speak, the reflection of our own personality, though we cannot alter its generic character, and therefore, if we oppose its generic tendency towards the universal good, we shall find in it the reflection of our own opposition and waywardness. The law of spirit proceeds unalterably on its course, and what is spoken of in popular phraseology as the divine wrath is nothing else than the reflex action which naturally follows when we put ourselves in opposition to this law. The evil that results is not a personal intervention of the universal spirit, which would imply its entering into specific manifestation, but it is the natural outcome of the causes that we ourselves have set in motion. But the effect to ourselves will be precisely the same as if they were brought about by the volition of an adverse personality, though we may not realize that in truth the personal element is our own. And if we are at all aware of the wonderfully complex nature of man, and the various interweavings of principles which unite the material body at one end of the scale to the purely spiritual ego at the other, we shall have some faint idea on how vast a field these adverse influences may operate, not being restricted to the plane of outward manifestation, but acting equally in those inner planes which give rise to the outer and are of a more enduring nature. Thus, the philosophic study of spirits, so far from affording any excuse for laxity of conduct, adds an emphatic definiteness to the Bible exhortation to flee from the wrath of God. But on the other hand, it delivers us from the groundless terrors, the fear lest our repentance should not be accepted, the fear lest we should be rejected for our inability to subscribe to some traditional dogma, the fear of utter uncertainty regarding the future. Fears which make life bitter and the prospect of death appalling to those who are in bondage to them. The knowledge that we are dealing with a power which is no respecter of persons, and in which is no variableness, which is in fact an unalterable law, at once delivers us from all these terrors. The very unchangeableness of law makes it certain that no amount of past opposition to it, whether from ignorance or willfulness, will prevent it from working in accordance with its own beneficent and life-giving character as soon as we quit our inverted position and place ourselves in our true relation towards it. The laws of nature do not harbor revenge, and once we adapt our methods to their character, they will work for us without taking any retrospective notice of our past errors. The law of spirit may be more complex than that of electricity because, as expressed in us, it is the law of conscious individuality. But it is nonetheless a purely natural law and follows the universal rule, and therefore we may dismiss from our minds, as a baseless figment, the fear of any divine power treasuring up anger against us on account of bygones, if we are sincerely seeking to do what is right now. The new causes which we put in motion now will produce their proper effect as surely as the old causes did, and thus the inaugurating a new sequence of good, we shall cut off the old sequence of evil. Only, of course, we cannot expect to bring about the new sequence while continuing to repeat the old causes, for the fruit must necessarily reproduce the nature of the seed. Thus we are the masters of the situation, and, whether in this world or the next, it rests with ourselves either to perpetuate the evil or to wipe it out and put the good in its place. And it may be noticed in passing that the great central Christian doctrine is based upon the most perfect knowledge of this law, and is the practical application to a profound problem of the deepest psychological science. But this is a large subject and cannot be suitably dealt with here. Much has been written and said on the origin of evil, and a volume might be filled with the detailed study of the subject, but for all practical purposes it may be summed up in the one word limitation. For what is the ultimate cause of all strife, whether public or private, but the notion that the supply of good is limited? With the bulk of mankind, this is a fixed idea, and they therefore argue that because there's only a certain limited quantity of good, the share in their possession can be increased only by correspondingly diminishing someone else's share. Anyone entertaining the same idea naturally resents the attempt to deprive him of any portion of this limited quantity, and hence arises the whole crop of envy, hatred, fraud, and violence, whether between individual classes or nations. If people only realize the truth that good is not a certain limited quantity, but a stream continuously flowing from the exhaustless infinite and ready to take any direction we choose to give it, and that each one is able by the action of his own thought to draw from it indefinitely, the substitution of this new and true idea for the old and false one of limitation would at one stroke remove all strife and struggle from the world. Every man would find a helper instead of a competitor in every other, and the very laws of nature, which now so often seem to war against us, would be found a ceaseless source of profit and delight. They could not enter into rest because of unbelief. They limited the Holy One of Israel. In these words, the Bible, like the New Thought, traces all the sorrow of the world, that terrible Weltschmerz which expresses itself with such direful influence through the pessimistic literature of the day, to the one root of a false belief, the belief in man's limitation. Only substitute it for the true belief, and the evil would be at an end. Now the ground of this true belief is that clear apprehension of the Father which, as I have shown, forms the basis of Jesus' teaching. If from one point of view, the intelligent universal life principle is a power to be obeyed, in the same sense in which we have to obey all the laws of nature, from the opposite point of view, it is a power to be used. We must never lose sight of the fact that obedience to any natural law in its generic tendency necessarily carries with it a corresponding power of using that law in specific application. This is the old proverb that knowledge is power. It is the old paradox with which Jesus posed the ignorant scribes as to how David's Lord could also be his son. The word David means beloved, and to be beloved implies that reciprocal sympathy which is intuitive knowledge. Hence David the beloved is the man who has realized his true relation as a son to his father and who is in tune with the infinite. On the other hand, this infinite is the Lord because it is the complex of all those unchangeable laws from which it is impossible to swerve without suffering consequent loss of power. And on the other, this knowledge of the innermost principles of all being puts him in possession of unlimited powers, which he can apply to any specific purpose that he will. And thus he stands towards them in the position of a father who has authority to command the service of his son. Thus David's Lord becomes, by a natural transition, his son. And it is precisely in this that the principle of sonship consists. It is the raising of man from condition of bondage as a servant by reason of limitation to the status of a son, by the entire removal of all limitations. To believe and act on this principle is to believe on the Son of God. And a practical belief in our own sonship thus sets us free from all evil and from all fear of evil. It brings us out of the kingdom of death into the kingdom of life. Like everything else, it has to grow, but the good seed of liberating truth, once planted in the heart, is sure to germinate. And the more we endeavor to foster its growth by seeking to grasp with our understanding the reason of these things and to realize our knowledge in practice, the more rapidly we shall find our lives increase in livingness, a joy to ourselves, a brightness to our homes, and a blessing expanding to all around in ever-widening circles. Enough has now been said to show the identity of principle between the teaching of the Bible and that of the New Thought. Treated in detail, the subject would extend to many volumes explanatory of the Old and New Testaments, and if that great work were ever carried out, I have no hesitation in saying that the agreement would be found to extend to the minutest particulars. But the hints contained in the foregoing papers will, I hope, suffice to show that there is nothing antagonistic between the two systems, or rather to show that they are one, the statement of the one truth, which always has been and always will be. And if what I have now endeavored to put before my readers should lead any of them to follow up the subject more fully for themselves, I can promise them an inexhaustible store of wonder, delight, and strength in the study of the old book in the light of the new thought. End of chapter. Chapter 20. Jachin and Boaz. And he reared up the pillars before the temple, one on the right hand and the other on the left, and called the name of that on the right hand Jachin, and the name of that on the left Boaz. From the second book of Chronicles, chapter 3, verse 17. Very likely some of us have wondered what was the meaning of these two mysterious pillars set up by Solomon in front of his temple, and why they were called by these strange names. And then we have dropped the subject as one of those inexplicable things handed down in the Bible from old time, which we suppose can have no practical interest for us at the present day. Nevertheless, these strange names are not without a purpose. They contain the key to the entire Bible and to the whole order of nature, and as emblems of the two great principles that are the pillars of the universe, they fitly stood at the threshold of that temple, which was designed to symbolize all the mysteries of being. In all the languages of the Semitic stock, the letters J and Y are interchangeable, as we see in the modern Arabic Yaqub for Jacob and the Old Hebrew Javeh for Jehovah. This gives us the form Jachin, which at once reveals the enigma. The word yak signifies one, and the termination he or hin is an intensive which may be rendered in English by only. Thus, the word Jachin resolves itself into the words one only, the all-embracing unity. The meaning of Boaz is clearly seen in the book of Ruth. There Boaz appears as the kinsman exercising the right of preemption so familiar to those versed in Oriental law, a right which has for its purpose the maintenance of the family as the social unit. According to this widely spread custom, the purchaser, who is not a member of the family, buys the property subject to the right of kinsmen within certain degrees to purchase it back, and so bring it once more into the family to which it originally belonged. Whatever may be our personal opinion regarding the vexed questions of dogmatic theology, we can all agree as to the general principle indicated in the role acted by Boaz. He brings back the alienated estate into the family, that is to say, he redeems it in the legal sense of the word. As a matter of law, his power to do this results from his membership in the family, but his motive for doing it is love, his affection for Ruth. Without pushing the analogy too far, we may say then that Boaz represents the principle of redemption in the widest sense of reclaiming an estate by right of relationship while the innermost moving power in its recovery is love. This is what Boaz stands for in the beautiful story of Ruth, and there is no reason why we should not let the same name stand for the same thing when we seek the meaning of the mysterious pillar. Thus, the two pillars typify unity and the redeeming power of love, with the significant suggestion that the redemption results from unity. They correspond with the two bonds or uniting principles spoken of by St. Paul, the unity of the Spirit, which is the bond of peace, and love, which is the bond of perfectness. The former is unity of being, the latter unity of intention, and the principle of this dual unity is well illustrated by the story of Boaz. The whole story proceeds on the idea of the family as the social unit, the root conception of all Oriental law, and if we consider the family in this light, we shall see how exactly it embodies the twofold idea of Jachin and Boaz, unity of being and unity of thought. The family forms a unit because all the members proceed from a common progenitor and are thus all of one blood. But although this gives them a natural unity of being of which they cannot divest themselves, it is not enough in itself to make them a united family, as unfortunately experience too often shows. Something more is wanted, and that something is love. There must be a personal union brought about by sympathetic thought to complete the natural union resulting from birth. The inherent unity must be expressed by the individual volition of each member, and thus the family becomes the ideally perfect social unit. A truth to which St. Paul alludes when he calls God the Father, from whom every family in heaven and earth is named. Thus Boaz stands for the principle which brings back to the original unity that which has been for a time separated from it. There has never been any separation of actual being. The family right always subsisted in the property even while in the hands of strangers. Otherwise it could never have been brought back. But it requires the love principle to put this right into effective operation. When this begins to work in the knowledge of its right to do so, then there is the return of the individual to the unity, the recognition of himself as the particular expression of the universal in virtue of his own nature. These two pillars, therefore, stand for the two great spiritual principles that are the basis of all life. Jachin typifying the unity resulting from being, and Boaz typifying the unity resulting from love. In this dual unity, we find the key to all conceivable involution or evolution of spirit. And it is therefore not without reason that the record of these two ancient pillars has been preserved in our scriptures. And finally, we may take this as an index to the character of our scriptures generally. They contain infinite meanings, and often those passages which appear on the surface to be most meaningless will be found to possess the deepest significance. The book, which we often read so superficially, hides beneath its sometimes seemingly trivial words the secrets of other things. The twin pillars, Jachin and Boaz, bear witness to this truth. Footnote: the following comment was made by Judge Troward after the publication of his paper in Expression. Quote, "The two pillars of the universe are personality and mathematics, represented by Boaz and Jachin respectively. This is the broadest simplification to which it is possible to reduce things. Balance consists in preserving the equilibrium or alternating current between these two principles. Personality is the absolute factor. Mathematics are the relative factor, for they merely measure different rates or scales. They are absolute in this respect. A particular scale having been selected, all its sequences will follow by an inexorable law of order and proportion. But the selection of the scale and the change from one scale to another rests entirely with personality. What personality cannot do is to make one scale produce the result of another, but it can set aside one scale and substitute another for it. Hence personality contains in itself the universal scale, or can either accommodate itself to lower rates of motion already established, or can raise them to its own rate of motion. Hence, personality is the grand ultimate fact in all things. Different personalities should be regarded as different degrees of consciousness. They are different degrees of emergence of the power that knows itself. End of quote. End of footnote. Chapter 21. Hephzibah. Thou shalt no more be termed forsaken, neither shall thy land any more be termed desolate, but thou shalt be called Hephzibah, and thy land Beulah. For the Lord delighteth in thee, and thy land shall be married. From the book of Isaiah. The name Hephzibah, or as it might be written, Hasbah, conveys a very distinct idea to anyone who has lived in the East, and calls up a string of familiar words all containing the same root, Hafz, Hafz, which includes guarding or taking care of, such as Hafiz, a protector, Muhafiz, a custodian, as in the word Muhafiz, Daftar, a head record keeper, or again, Hifazat, custody, as Bahifazat Polis, in custody of the police, or again, Daim ul Hafz, imprisonment for life, and other similar expressions. All words from this root suggest the idea of guarding, and therefore the name Hephzibah at once speaks its own meaning. It is one who is guarded, a protected one. And answering to this, there must be some power which guards, and the name of this power is given in Hosea, where it is called Ishi. And it shall be at that day, saith the Lord, that thou shalt call me Ishi, and thou shalt call me no more Bali. Bali means Lord, Ishi means husband, and between the two there is a whole world of distinction. To call the great power Bali is to live in one world, and to call it Ishi is to live in another. The world that is ruled over by Bali is a world of miserable worms of the dust, and such crawling creatures, but the world that is warmed and lighted by Ishi is one in which man and woman walk upright, conscious of their own divine nature, instead of dodging about to escape being crushed under the feet of Moloch as he strides through his dominions. If the name Bali did not suggest a wrong idea, there would be no need to change it for another, and the change of name therefore indicates the opening of the mind to a larger and sounder conception of the true nature of the ruling principle of the universe. It is no imperious autocrat, the very apotheosis of self-glorification, ill-natured and spiteful if its childish vanity be too gratified by hearing its own praises formally proclaimed, often from lips opened only by fear. Nor is it an almighty extortioner desiring to deprive us of what we value most, either to satisfy its greed or to demonstrate its sovereignty. This is the image which men make of God and then bow terrified before it, offering a worship which is the worship of Baal, and making life blank because all the livingness has been wiped out of it. Ishi is the embodiment of the very opposite conception, a wise and affectionate husband instead of a taskmaster exploiting his slaves. In its true aspect, the relation of husband and wife is entirely devoid of any question of relative superiority or inferiority. As well ask whether the front wheel or the back wheel of your bicycle is the more important. The two make a single whole, in which the function of both parts are reciprocal and equally necessary. Yet for this very reason these functions cannot be identical. In a well-ordered home, where husband and wife are united by mutual love and respect, we see that the man's function is to enter into the larger world and to provide the wife with all that is needed for the maintenance and comfort of the home, while the function of the woman is to be the distributor of what her husband provides, in doing which she follows her own discretion. And a sensible man, knowing that he can trust a sensible wife, does not want to poke his finger into every pie. Thus all things run harmoniously, the woman relieved of responsibilities which are not naturally hers, and the man relieved of responsibilities which are not naturally his. But let any perplexity or danger arise, and the woman knows that from her husband she will receive all the guidance and protection that the occasion may acquire, he being the wise and strong man that we have supposed him, and having this assurance, she is able to pursue the avocations of her own sphere undisturbed by any fears or anxieties. It is this relation of protection and guidance that is implied by the word Hephzibah. It is the name of those who realize their identity with the all-ordering divine spirit. He who realizes this unity with the spirit finds himself both guided and guarded. And here we touch the fringe of a deep natural mystery, which formed the basis of all that was most valuable in the higher mysteries of the ancients, substance of which we must realize if we are to make any progress in the future, whatever form we may adopt to convey the idea to ourselves or others. It is the relation of the individual mind to the universal mind, the combination of unity with independence which, though quite clear when we know it by personal experience, is almost inexpressible in words, but which is frequently represented in the Bible under the figure of the marriage relations. It is a basic principle, and in various modes pervades all nature, and has been symbolized in every religion the world has known. And in proportion as the individual realizes this relation, he will find that he is able to use the universal mind, while at the same time he is guided and guarded by it. For think what it would be to wield the power of the universal mind without having its guidance. It would be the old story of Phaeton trying to drive the chariot of the sun, which ended in his own destruction. And limitless power without corresponding guidance would be the most terrible curse that anyone could bring upon his head. The relation between the individual mind and the universal mind, as portrayed in the reciprocal connected names of Hephzibah and Ishi, must never be lost sight of. For the great guiding mind, immeasurably as it transcends our intellectual consciousness, is not another than ourselves. It is the one self which is the foundation of all the individual selves, and which is therefore in all its limitlessness as entirely one with each individual as though no other being existed. Therefore we do not have to go out of ourselves to find it, for it is the expansion to infinity of all that we truly are, having indeed no place for those negative forms of evil with which we people a world of illusion, for it is the very light itself, and in it all illusion is dispelled. But it is the expansion to infinity of all in us that is affirmative, all that is really living. Therefore, in looking for its guiding and guarding, we are relying upon no borrowed power from without, held at the caprice and option of another, but upon the supreme fact of our own nature, which we can use in what direction we will with perfect freedom, knowing no limitation save the obligation not to do violence to our own purest and highest feelings. And this relation is entirely natural. We must steer the happy mean between imploring and ignoring. A natural law does not need to be entreated before it will work, and on the other hand, we cannot make use of it while ignoring its existence. What we do have to do, therefore, is to take the working of the law for granted and make sure of it accordingly. And since that is the law of mind, and mind is personality, this power, which is at once ourselves and above ourselves, may be treated as a person and may be spoken with, and its replies received by the inner ear of the heart. Any scheme of philosophy that does not result in this personal intercourse with the divine mind falls short of the mark. It may be right so far as it goes, but it does not go far enough and fails to connect us with our vital center. Names are of small importance so long as the intercourse is real. The supreme mind with which we converse is only to be met in the profoundest depths of our own being, and, as Tennyson says, is more perfectly ourselves than our own hands and feet. It is our natural base, and realizing this we shall find ourselves to be in very truth guarded ones, guided by the Spirit in all things, nothing too great and nothing too trivial to come within the great law of our being. There is another aspect of the Spirit in which it is seen as a power to be used, and the full flow of life is in the constant alternation between this aspect and the one we have been considering, But always we are linked with the universal mind as the flower lives by reason of its root. The connection itself is intrinsic and can never be severed, but it must be consciously realized before it can be consciously used. All our development consists in the increasing consciousness of this connection, which enables us to apply the higher power to whatever purpose we may have in hand, not merely in the hope that it may respond, but with the certain knowledge that by the law of its own nature it is bound to do so, and likewise with the knowledge that by the same law it is bound also to guide us to the selection of right objects and right methods. Experience will teach us to detect the warning movement of the inner guide. A deep-seated sense of dissatisfaction, an indescribable feeling that somehow everything is not right, are the indications to which we do well to pay heed, for we are guarded ones, and these interior monitions are the working of that innermost principle of our own being, which is the immediate outflowing of the great universal life into individuality. But, paying heed to this, we shall find ourselves guarded not as prisoners, but as a loved and honored wife, whose freedom is assured by a protection which will allow no harm to assail her. We shall find that the law of our nature is liberty, and that nothing but our own want of understanding can shut us out from it. End of chapter. Chapter 22. Mind and Hand. I have before me a curious piece of ancient Egyptian symbolism. It represents the sun sending down to the earth innumerable rays, with the peculiarity that each ray terminates in a hand. This method of representing the sun is so unusual that it suggests the presence in the designer's mind of some idea rather different from those generally associated with the sun as a spiritual emblem. And if I interpret this symbol rightly, it sets forth the truth, not only of the divine being as the great source of all life and of all illumination, but also the correlative truth of our individual relation to that center. Each ray is terminated by a hand, and a hand is the emblem of active working. And I think it would be difficult to give a better symbolic representation of innumerable individualities, each working separately, yet all deriving their activity from a common source. The hand is at work upon the earth, and the sun, from which it is a ray, is shining in the heavens. But the connecting line shows whence all the strength and skill of the hand are derived. If we look at the microcosm of our own person, we find this principle exactly reproduced. Our hand is the instrument by which all work is done, literary, artistic, mechanical, or household. But we know that all this work is really the work of the mind, the willpower at the center of our system, which first determines what is to be done, and then sets the hand to work to do it. And in the doing of it, the mind and hand become one, so that the hand is none other than the mind working. Now, transferring this analogy to the microcosm, we see that we each stand in the same relation to the universal mind that our hand does to our individual mind. At least that it is our normal relation, and we shall never put forth our full strength except from this standpoint. We rightly realize our will as the center of our individuality, but we should do better to picture our individuality as an ellipse rather than a circle, a figure having two conjugate foci, two equilibrated centers of revolution rather than a single one of which the willpower or faculty of doing, and the other the consciousness or perception of being. If we realize only one of these two centers, we shall lose both mental and moral balance. If we lose light of the center which is our personal will, we shall become flabby visionaries without any backbone. And if, in our anxiety to develop backbone, we lost sight of the other center, we shall find that we have lost that which corresponds to the lungs and heart in the physical body, and that our backbone, however perfectly developed, is rapidly drying up for want of those functions which minister vitality to the whole system, and is only fit to be hung up in a museum to show what a rigid, lifeless thing the strongest vertebral column becomes when separated from the organization by which alone it can receive nourishment. We must realize the one focus of our individuality as clearly as the other, and bring both into equal balance if we would develop all our powers and rise to the perfection of life, which has no limits to its glorious possibilities. Keeping the ancient symbol before used, and considering ourselves as the hand, we find that we derive all our power from an infinite center, and because it is infinite, we need never fear that we shall fail to draw to ourselves all that we require for our work, whether it be the intelligence to lay hold of the proper tool or the strength to use it. And, moreover, we learn from the symbol that this central power is generic. This is the most important truth. It is the center from which all the hands proceed, and is as fully open to any one hand as to any other. Each hand is doing its separate work, and the whole of the central energy is at its disposal for its own specific purpose. The work of the central energy, as such, is to supply vitality to the hands, and it is they that differentiate this universal power into all the varied forms of application which their different aptitudes and opportunities suggest. We, as the hands, live and work because the central mind lives and works in us. We are one with it, and it is one with us. And so long as we keep this primal truth before us, we realize ourselves as beings of unlimited goodness and intelligence and power, and we work in the fullness of strength and confidence accordingly. But if we lose sight of this truth, we shall find that the strongest will must get exhausted at last in the unequaled struggle of the individual against the universe. For if we do not recognize the central mind as the source of our vitality, we are literally fighting for our own hand, and all the other hands are against us, for we have lost the principle of connection with them. This is what must infallibly happen if we rely on nothing but our individual willpower. But if we realize that the will is the power by which we give out, and that every giving out implies a corresponding taking in, then we shall find in the boundless ocean of central living spirit the source from which we can go on taking in ad infinitum, and which thus enables us to give out to any extent we please. But for wise and effective giving out, a strong and enlightened will is an absolute necessity, and therefore we do well to cultivate the will, or the active side of our nature. But we must equally cultivate the receptive side also, and when we do this rightly by seeing in the infinite mind the one source of supply, our willpower becomes intensified by the knowledge that the whole power of the infinite is present to back it up. And with this continual sense of infinite power behind us, we can go calmly and steadily to the accomplishment of any purpose, however difficult, without straining or effort, knowing that it shall be achieved, not by the hand only, but by the invisible mind that works through it, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, said the Lord of hosts. End of chapter. Chapter 23. The Central Control. In contemplating the relations between body, soul, and spirit, between universal mind and individual mind, the methodized study of which constitutes mental science, we must never forget that these relations indicate not the separateness, but the unity of these principles. We must learn not to attribute one part of our action to one part of our being and another to another. Neither the action nor the functions are split up into separate parts. The action is a whole, and the being that does it is a whole. And in the healthy organism, the reciprocal movements of the principles are so harmonious as never to suggest any feeling than that of a perfectly whole and undivided self. If there is any other feeling, we may be sure that there is abnormal action somewhere, and we should set ourselves to discover and remove the cause of it. The reason for this is that in any perfect organism there cannot be more than one center of control. A rivalry of controlling principles would be the destruction of the organic wholeness, for either the elements would separate and group themselves round one or other of the centers according to their respective affinities, and thus form two distinctive individualities, or else they would be reduced to a condition of merely chaotic confusion. In either case, the original organism would cease to exist. Seen in this light, therefore, it is a self-evident truth that if we are to retain our individuality, in other words, if we are to continue to exist, it can be only by retaining our hold upon the central controlling principle in ourselves. And if this be the charter of our being, it follows that all our future development depends on our recognizing and accepting this central controlling principle. To this end, therefore, all our endeavors should be directed, for otherwise all our studies in mental science will only lead us into a confused labyrinth of principles and counter-principles, which will be considerably worse than the state of ignorant simplicity from which we started. This central controlling principle is the will, and we must never lose sight of the fact that all the other principles about which we have learnt in our studies exist only as its instruments. The will is the true self, of which they are all functions, and all our progress consists of our increased recognition of the fact. It is the will that says, I am, and therefore, however exalted, or even in their higher developments apparently miraculous, our powers may be, they are all subject to the central controlling power of the will. When the enlightened will shall have learned to identify itself perfectly with the limitless power of knowledge, judgment, and creative thought which are at its disposal, then the individual will have attained the perfect wholeness, and all limitations will have passed away forever. And nothing short of this consciousness of perfect wholeness can satisfy us. Everything that falls short of it is in that degree an embodiment of the principle of death, that great enemy against which the principle of life must continue to wage unceasing war in whatever form or measure it may show itself, until death is swallowed up in victory. There can be no compromise. Either we are affirming life as a principle, or we are denying it, no matter on how great or how small a scale. And the criterion by which to determine our attitude is our realization of our wholeness. Death is the principle of disintegration. And whenever we admit the power of any portion of our organism, whether spiritual or bodily, to induce any condition independently of the intention of the will, we admit that the force of disintegration is superior to the controlling center in ourselves, and we conceive ourselves as held in bondage of an adversary, from which bondage the only way of release is by the attainment of a truer way of thinking. And the reason is that, either through ignorance or carelessness, we have surrendered our position of control over the system as a whole, and have lost the element of purpose, around which the consciousness of individuality must always center. Every state of our consciousness, whether active or passive, should be the result of a distinct purpose adopted by our own free will, for the passive states should be quite as much under the control of the will as the active. It is the lack of purpose that deprives us power. The higher and more clearly define our purpose, the greater stimulus we have for realizing our control over all our faculties for its attainment. And since the grandest of all purposes is the strengthening and ennobling of life, in proportion as we make this our aim, we shall find ourselves in union with the Supreme Universal Mind, acting each in our individual sphere for the furtherance of the same purpose which animates the ruling principle of the great whole, and, as a consequence, shall find that its intelligence and powers are at our disposal. But in all this there must be no strain. The true exercise of the will is not an exercise of unnatural force. It is simply the leading of our powers into their natural channels by intelligently recognizing the direction in which those channels go. However various in detail, they have one clearly defined common tendency towards the increasing of life, whether in ourselves or in others, and if we keep this steadily in view, all our powers, whether interior or exterior, will be found to work so harmoniously together that there will be no sense of independent action on the part of any one of them. The distinctions drawn for purposes of study will be laid aside, and the self in us will be found to be the realization of a grand ideal being, at once individual and universal, consciously free in its individual wholeness and in its joyous participation in the life of the universal whole. End of chapter. Chapter 24. What is higher thought? A resolution passed October 1902 by the Kensington Higher Thought Center, quote, that the center stands for the definite teaching of absolute oneness of creator and creation, cause and effect, and that nothing which may contradict or be in opposition to the above principles be admitted to the higher thought center platform. By oneness of cause and effect is meant that effect, man, does consist only of what cause is, but apart individual personality is not therefore coextensive with the whole. End quote. This resolution is of the greatest importance. Once admit that there is any power outside yourself, however beneficent you may conceive it to be, and you have sown the seed which must sooner or later bear the fruit of fear, which is the center ruin of life, love, and liberty. There is no via media. Say we're only reflections, however accurate, of the life, and in the admission we have given away our birthright. However small or plausible may be the germ of thought which admits that we are anything less in principle than the life itself, it must bring up to the ultimate ruin of the life principle itself. We are it itself. The difference is only that between the generic and the specific of the same thing. We must contend earnestly, both within ourselves and outwardly, for the one great foundation, and never, now on to all eternity, admit for a single instant any thought which is opposed to this, the basic truth of being. The leading ideas connected with higher thought are 1. That man controls circumstances instead of being controlled by them, and 2. As a consequence of the foregoing, that whatever teaches us to rely on power borrowed from a source outside ourselves is not higher thought, and that whatever explains to us the infinite source of our inherent power and the consequent limitless nature of that power is higher thought. This avoids the use of terms which may only puzzle those not accustomed to abstract phraseology, and is substantially the same as the resolution of 1902. End of chapter. Chapter 25. Fragments. 1. God is love. Man, having the understanding of God, speaks the word of power. 2. Man gives utterance to God. 3. The Father is equilibrium. The Son is concentration of the same Spirit. The Spirit is projection. The triune relation always consists of these three. 1. The potential. 2. The ideal. 3. The concrete life. 1. The potential is life in its most highly abstract mode, not yet brought into form even as thought, not particularized in any way. 2. The ideal is the particularizing of the potential into a certain formulated thought. 3. The concrete is the manifestation of the formulated thought in visible form. What everybody wants is to become more alive. As Jesus said, I am come that they might have life and might have it more abundantly. And it is only on the basis of realizing ourselves as a perfect unity throughout, not made up of opposing parts, and that unity spirit, that we can realize in ourselves the livingness which Spirit is, and which we as Spirit ought to be. Hence, perfect demonstration. The truth shall make you free. Life, love equals the truth, liberty. The ultimate truth will always be found to consist of these three, and anything that is contrary to them is contrary to fundamental truth. Worship. Worship consists in the recognition of the personal nature of Holy Spirit and the continual alternation, pulsation between the two positions of I am the person that thou art and thou art the person that I am. The two personalities are one. End of chapter. And also, this is the end of the reading of the book titled The Hidden Power by Judge Thomas Troward. Before heading out, please do hit that like button. If there's anything that resonated with you, leave me a comment and subscribe to the channel.